When you're ready.
Alright, hi guys, my name is Bobby Hoock. I'm a sport performance intern coach at Marquette University for the fall semester of 2017. And I'm here to present to you guys on the training progression and an annual plan for an Olympic level judoka, or someone who competes in judo at the US and international level. So I'm going to start off with just a video to show you guys sort of what that scenario is like, and then we'll get into more of the biomechanics and all of that other stuff as well. Cutting off right there, I want to give you guys a little overview of how judo is basically at that international level, a little more of the scoring and penalty systems that. So it was first introduced at the Olympic level at the Tokyo Summer Games in 1964. It was the first time that both women and men were allowed to compete in judo. They had other sort of forms before that, such as taekwondo, but this was the first time judo was actually brought in. It had been serving as world competition at the International Judo Federation World Championships prior to this, but this was the first time it had ever been really widely broadcasted on the world stage. There are 3 different ways that you can score. In judo, as you can see in that video, there's a lot of throwing, especially on the back. The first one is called an ippon. It's going to give you 100 points. It's also just known as the automatic victory. There are 3 qualifications for it. What you need to do to win an ippon is you need to throw your opponent on their back. You need to have enough force so that they're lying on the ground for at least a half a second, and there needs to be a judge notice on it. So the judge will put their arm out noticing that there is an ippon, and the judges are actually on the mat as well, sort of serving as referees as well. There are a couple other ways you can score. If it doesn't automatically come to an ippon, you can score an owaza-ari, which is essentially the same thing as an ippon, but you're lacking one of those 3 factors. Either the judge missed it, normally doesn't happen, or they don't believe that there was enough force, or the opponent landed on their side rather than their back. The last one is the yuko on 1 point. Those are normally judge-given points, normally at the end of a match to decide a victory, sort of as they do in boxing as well. As there are point systems, there are also penalties that you can incur, sort of taking away from that total. First one is a hansoku make. That's basically going to be your immediate disqualification no matter what. Often unsportsmanlike conduct, something super big, especially in all of the Olympic martial arts, taking sort of that tradition and keeping it very strong and secure. And that can also be in a chokehold, a legal move. There's a number of other qualifications that can serve that. And then a shido is your other penalty. You're going to be a slight infringement, such as stepping out of the ring, possibly another judge mark, once again, sort of those. Yukos and shidos are more judge-based infractions. So just a biomechanical movement pattern analysis of how I'm going to be training these athletes. There are equal energy system requirements, sort of over all 3 of the main ones. We're going to be starting off noticing the aerobic system. All Olympic judo matches do last 5 minutes in regulation. There are no overtimes, that's sort of when it comes down to points. So obviously that aerobic system, you're going to be grappling a lot on the mat, sort of exceeding the amount that the glycolytic energy system could actually provide for you. So that's where we're going to be training a lot of that endurance as well. Moving into the glycolytic system, as you can see in the video, there's a lot of grappling that can happen. Sometimes they'll back off a little bit before going back underway, but a lot of those grapples can last 30 to 60 seconds when you're trying to sort of get in a position where you might be able to score an ippon and win that match, and that's going to be where your glycolytic system is going to take over overall. And sometimes you can see they'll be backing off and someone will get in an ideal position for an ippon, and that's going to be where your creatine and phosphate system is going to be able to. Once again, 5 to 15 seconds of that absolute power, and during a throw, that's the system that they're going to be utilizing most often, especially during those scoring opportunities. Going through the primary muscle groups that we're going to be using, a lot of the leg muscles you can see are either used for stepping in so that they can get in a position to drop their opponent on their back, as well as for a lot of that stability when they're being grappled by their opponents. Moving into the core is probably the most important muscle group based on my research in judo, due to the fact that you're going to be using a lot of core when you're throwing. You're going to be pulling that opponent over your shoulder, over your side, and as well as if you're being thrown in an ippon, your core is going to allow you to twist out of that position, possibly land on your side, maybe only let your opponent score 10 points instead of that full 100. Arms, there's a forearm emphasis in judo that I'm going to get into later, but basically the only grabs that they can do are either around the body or on the gi or their uniform, so having that grip strength is going to be super important to make sure that they can jostle their way into a proper position to ideally score those points. And then the back, a lot of that motion once again is pulling, trying to get your opponent really in close to you so you can have that dominating leverage. And those are the 4 main muscle groups, obviously more in depth later on, about how I'm going to be training these athletes for an Olympic level judo. So there's a lot of common injuries that can happen in judo, especially just going to go through them body part by body part. Anything in your back, you can ensure slip disc, deep spinal muscle strains, a lot of that from landing on your back, being pulled over, really extending that full spinal flexion. A lot of that can happen, mostly back pain overall, which normally we'll just treat with heat treatment. But that's one of the most common ones you'll see just across the board. Shoulder, you can often impingement syndrome, which happens a lot with people that are main offensive players. Offensive judokas who are scoring a lot, you're going to be impinging that shoulder a lot as you move through match. Neck strains and impact injuries are going to be the most common that you're going to see just among impact being landed on their back. You can see there was one example in the video where they landed on their head, so that's going to be a lot of the neck injuries you're going to see, not a lot of whiplash or anything like that. Moving back into our shoulder, just on the other side, AC joint sprains are going to be huge, that acromioclavicular joint. A lot of that just from those powerful jostling back and forth, grappling with that other opponent. Fingers, once again, as you can see when you grapple onto that other opponent's gi, it's super easy to just dislocate fingers, get other sort of strains like that. Finger breaks are super common, and that's why you can see a lot of them will actually compete still with tape, due to the fact that they're not going to use a cast, but still compete just because they happen even in practice. And then contusions and bruising, sort of the same thing as the neck on your elbow landing, taking a lot of those impact injuries as well. And then you can incur a lot of ligament damage, ligament sprains, especially in that knee. ACL tears are super common in judo due to the fact that it's that anterior translation and internal rotation, and a lot of that when they're competing barefoot on the mat, getting twisted around a lot of times if they're thrown too hard into one side, especially rotating over that planted foot. ACL tears are very, very common. Getting more into the competition schedule, sort of how I'm going to be training these athletes over the calendar year. It's governing body dependent, so rather than some organizations like the NFL, where it's sort of the main governing body for football, there are 3 main governing bodies for the sport of judo. There's the International Judo Federation, the Kodokan Judo Institute, and the World Judo Federation. So those are all going to be individually operating bodies. All of them are legal to compete at the Olympics, which is the main competition that I'm focusing around. Then here we're going to demonstrate sort of 4 big competition styles that we have. Grand Prix are the same thing as Grand Slams down at the bottom. They're going to be multi-stage competitions. We're sort of focusing on different day events. You're going to have invitationals, sort of one-day super common events. A lot of athletes can compete these on their own, and then training camps are ones that they're legally required to compete at if you're going to the NFL. There's a tournament style, basically going to be set up in a bracket. You're going to compete 5 to 7 times over the course, obviously resulting in a grand champion at the end. This is going to be different than a lot of other sports, maybe where you're focusing on more scoring as many points as possible rather than one giant score at the end. Here, the psychological importance factor is absolutely massive here, really focusing on if athletes need to be in the correct mindset, which is something that I'm going to touch on a little bit later on. So just my annual plan really quick. Judo is sort of a sport where we have an optional off-season, just due to the fact that once again with those governing bodies you can compete at a multitude of different events, obviously. Here, circulating around the Olympics, I did manage to find an off-season here for 9 weeks. It's going to be those blocks in red. This giant graph here at the bottom is going to be a rough intensity graph throughout the entirety of the calendar year. The preseason, once again, going to be very short, leading into a very, very long in-season of 39 weeks, and that's going to be all competition. You're going to have 2 or 3 week breaks in between, but obviously it's going to be a very, very long in-season compared to a lot of other more regulated sports. Some additional requirements that are sort of unique to judo, a lot of their nutrition is going to be super important, especially if they're competing in Grand Slams or Grand Prix, where they're going to be competing 5 to 7 times a day for possibly 5 to 7 days in total. Vaccines are super important, where they compete around the world. They're going to be super in contact, really sweaty with one another. So the International Judo Federation does require all athletes to be updated on vaccines at least a couple times a year if they're going to different competitions around the world. And then recovery, once again with any other sport, you can see some spots in pink down at the bottom. Those are going to be our main, focusing on recovery weeks, really focusing on hopefully we can make sure they're not overused during that really long in season. So focusing on our off season, once again, really optional. Sometimes a lot of judokas won't have off seasons, but this is the best I could come up with. Once again, we have an intensity graph down at the bottom, sort of focusing on how that 9-week off season is going to be focused on. Here, we're going to be training them a lot with core movements, not really anything sport specific. Your benches, your squats, your lunges, etc., deadlifts. Main movements where we can train as many muscle groups as possible and really build up that strength, focusing on that smaller rep and set range. Once again, the strength progression, we're focusing on strength rather than power, which I'm going to touch on more in the pre and in season. But strength here, we're really trying to just build up those main muscle groups, especially ones that they might be particularly lacking in. And then as you can see, there's a giant decrease going into the preseason just because that preseason is so short, and then immediately leading into competition. We're going to try and decrease that intensity as we do lead into the preseason. I have my basic preseason set up right here. Once again, only 4 weeks, so we have our intensity graph using that 1, 2, 3, 2 stair-step method so we can gradually have a progressive overload. Here, I do have 3 different lifting schedules that we're going to have, basically interluded with practice and rest. Some basic examples we're going to start to increase that sport specificity a little bit. Just some numbers right here about how we're going to do some set rep ranges for both the lower and the upper body, basically increasing that intensity and then decreasing that volume a little bit as we do get closer to the overall season. So once again, having these different varying lifting sessions just allows us to focus a little bit on different muscles and slowly increase that sport specificity as we approach the in-season. In-season right here, once again, I have 2 circuits that I've laid out for you, and then I have blocks 3 and 4 written down at the bottom. Those are just due to the fact that since we do have such a long in-season, that I'm going to try and vary it up just a little bit so they don't get bored doing the same 2 lifting sessions over and over and over again. As you can see, we try and keep the intensity a bit same over here, but here at our progressive overload, we're really going to be focusing on building up that power, that nice, how much weight they can move in the shortest amount of time, so that they can be prepared to both absorb those blows from a nippon, as well as being able to actually throw their other opponent and grapple with them. Our baseline, a lot of mine, once again, are going to be plyometric movements. You can see squat jumps up there as well. Basically, we're going to be using squat jumps, but basing our numbers that we're going to get, we're going to be testing them on their max squat, their max bench, etc., and then be able to translate that into other plyometric movements. Once again, increasing the number of exercises just so they don't get bored. Rather than focusing on maybe increasing their strength, we're going to increase their power, so it's going to take less time overall on the lift, allowing us that with the time that we do have with them, being able to add in more movements, have different exercises overall, just to decrease boredom, especially with that super, super long 39-week in season. I have circuits here as well at the end. Basically, during my experience so far, I've noticed that circuits overall as a team, such as the 10-5-10 and core circuits as well, are really great opportunities for the team morale to build up. Even though they're competing here as individuals, they are going to be still part of the U.S. Olympic team. So being able to build that camaraderie, build that teamwork is something I believe that's super important in the overall training schedule, as well as just a nice finisher overall. Here, once again, you can see we're increasing the specificity, especially in the climber grip chin, sort of that second to last exercise in our first circuit, really focusing on increasing that forearm strength, being able to justify that what they're doing is actually going to help them on the mat. And then you can see we have 2 big drops, mostly around week 10 and week 25 of that in-season. Systemic drops are what I call them, just so that we can really drop that intensity as they prepare. The first one is going to be for the Grand Prix final, one of the biggest scoring and paying opportunities in the International Judo Federation. And the second one is obviously for the Olympics. This is set in the year 2020. So just some trivia, see what you guys learned over the course of my presentation so far. We're going to have, what is the one way to automatically win an Olympic judo match without that opponent disqualification? A waza-ari, a nippon, a shido, fatality, or there is no way to automatically win?
B.
B? Anyone else disagree with that? Absolutely, it's a nippon. Once again, that 100 point back throw with enough force to disable their opponent. So just a conclusion, this is my sort of annual plan on how to present for U.S. Olympic Professional Judo. My name is Bobby Hoock, Marquette University Sport Performance Coach in the fall 2017 semester. Thank you guys so much.
Good. Okay. Open it up to about 3 minutes of any questions that anybody has, where it's clarification or general questions about Bobby's presentation. Just raise your hand, and then Bobby will pick you out himself.
Yes.
So for your in season, are you doing those same workouts every week for the whole 39-week in season?
No, so that's why we're training with that 4-week block schedule. So sometimes they'll have 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 2 and 4.
Okay.
Really
So
trying to switch up that schedule so that they
but
do.
it's the same workouts, like rotated through.
That would be correct. But since we do have 4, it sort of provides a really big multitude of options for them, as well as it sort of gives us an opportunity to gauge their progression along the way. Yes.
Do judo athletes compete in weight classes?
They do compete in weight classes. So this one specifically was set for a half middleweight, which is roughly 70 to 84 kilograms. So judo, rather than powerlifting, has a lot bigger weight classes overall, so it provides a lot more interest in that sort of nutrition aspect, so we can see whether they want them to be really low or really high in that weight class. Yeah.
How would you plan on training them if they're in the middle of a weight cut leading up to a meet?
If they're in the middle of a weight cut leading up to a meet, it really depends on how they work as an athlete. Once again, a lot of people can sort of wait out their opponent if they have that higher aerobic strength, and maybe we'd want to have them to be a little bit lighter. They can move around, sort of evade that, even though you can be penalized for defensive maneuvers since judo is such an offensive sport. But if they're more of a dominant player that you see they're going to come right off the bat and try and go for that throw, we're going to want to have them in that upper weight class so they can have that power to sort of take over their opponent.
You mentioned that ACL tears are extremely common in judo. So, as part of your plan, what are you going to try and do to reduce the risk factors that an ACL injury might occur?
Absolutely. So in my lower body movements, I put a little bit of demo in the preseason and the in-season. We have a lot of unilateral lower body movements, really focusing on our lunges, our side lunges as well, to really focus those knee stabilizing muscles as well, a lot of where that injury is going to occur. So, and I did say unilateral movements really just important overall, but really being able to build that stabilization and build that really strong on either leg, especially if they're weaker on one, we can change more on the right on the left or the left on the right and vice versa.
Any other questions? All right, good stuff.